It was a quiet evening when the phone call came, but the voice on the other end of the line would forever change everything. The man who once stood as the symbol of justice, the one who had sent an innocent man to prison, was now desperately pleading for his help. The irony of the situation seemed almost too much to bear. After years of a broken, unforgiving system, could forgiveness really be possible? The story begins over a decade ago, in a courtroom where a young black man, Jamal Thompson, stood accused of a crime he did not commit. The prosecutor, Thomas Blake, was known for his relentless drive to convict. But his pursuit of justice wasn't guided by truth. It was motivated by bias, prejudice, and a deep-seated belief that some lives mattered less than others. For Blake, it wasn't about what was right. It was about winning, no matter the cost. And so, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, Jamal was sent to prison. Jamal's life was destroyed in an instant. A bright future, full of promise, was stolen away by a system that failed him. Behind bars, he would endure years of unimaginable hardship, surrounded by violence and injustice. He thought about his family, his mother who cried herself to sleep every night, his little sister who grew up without her big brother. He thought about the friends who had abandoned him, the dreams that would never come true. His only solace was the belief that one day the truth would come out and he would be set free. But in the years that followed, the case seemed to slip away from the public's memory. The prosecutor, Thomas Blake, went on with his career, furthering his reputation as a man who could get convictions. His arrogance and overconfidence in his ability to manipulate the system made him untouchable, a pillar of the legal world. He never thought twice about Jamal or the mistake he had made. After all, Blake was doing what he thought was right, wasn't he? And then, out of nowhere, something happened that no one saw coming. Blake found himself in a situation that he couldn't control, something that threatened everything he had worked for. The tables had turned. It was a twist of fate, a moment of reckoning, that would force the prosecutor to finally confront the consequences of his actions. Now, after years of silence, Blake needed something Jamal had always known he would need: redemption. But would Jamal, after all the pain he had endured, be willing to help the man who had ruined his life? Would he forgive the prosecutor who had stood in the way of his freedom? Could he trust someone who had once treated him as nothing more than a casualty in a game of law? In the next chapter of this incredible story, we will uncover what happened when the prosecutor, now desperate and broken, reached out to the man he once wronged. Will Jamal find the strength to rise above his bitterness, or will this be a story of justice long overdue? Stay tuned, because the twists are far from over, and this story is just getting started. The years after Jamal Thompson was sentenced felt like an eternity. At first, he didn't understand what had happened. He remembered standing in that courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest, watching as the prosecutor, Thomas Blake, presented a case built on lies. The evidence against him was flimsy at best: witnesses who were either coerced or unreliable, a defense attorney too overwhelmed to stand up to the system, and a judge who seemed indifferent to the idea of justice. Jamal had tried to speak up, to tell them all the truth, but it didn't matter. His voice was drowned out by the weight of his skin, his race, and the prejudice that ran deeper than the law itself. Prison was an unrecognizable world to him. The walls felt cold, the air thick with the stench of failure and desperation. Jamal was placed in a maximum security facility, a place where the rules of society were replaced by violence, survival, and a constant threat of danger. He learned quickly how to keep his head down and trust no one, though that didn't stop the daily abuse he faced from both inmates and guards alike. There were days when the weight of the injustice was too much to bear, when he felt like he was suffocating in a system that had thrown him away without a second thought. Yet, despite everything, Jamal held on to a sliver of hope. He kept reminding himself that the truth would eventually come to light, that someone would realize the mistake that had been made. But as the years passed, hope started to fade. His letters to lawyers and legal organizations went unanswered. His family struggled to keep up with the mounting costs of trying to appeal his case, and eventually they stopped writing. It felt like the world had forgotten about him. As for Thomas Blake, life continued on for him. After the conviction, Blake's career only flourished. He moved up the ranks quickly, becoming a well-known figure in legal circles. He took pride in his ability to secure convictions, his reputation as a tough prosecutor growing stronger with each passing case. For years, he was untouchable, respected, even admired by his peers. He had no reason to look back. In his mind, the case was settled and Jamal was just another statistic. But things began to change slowly for Blake. It wasn't one single event, but a series of small cracks that started to show in his perfect life. It began with a case he had taken on in the years following Jamal's conviction. A young woman accused of a crime she didn't commit. Blake, always the professional, pushed for a conviction with the same intensity he had in Jamal's case, convinced that the evidence was enough. Yet, this time, something went wrong. The defense attorney wasn't as easy to intimidate. The jury didn't fall for the usual tricks. And when the verdict came down, not guilty, Blake's entire world seemed to tilt. It was a humiliation Blake wasn't used to. He couldn't shake the feeling that the legal system had failed him for the first time in his career. He had done everything right, had put every ounce of his skill into the case, and still, the truth had slipped through his fingers. That loss haunted him, lingering in his thoughts, gnawing at his confidence. Blake began to question his ability. Maybe, just maybe, his obsession with securing convictions had blinded him. Maybe, in his single-minded pursuit of winning, he had ignored something far more important, the truth. Then came the scandal, a high-profile case involving another prosecutor, a former colleague of Blake's, who was caught in a massive corruption scandal. The media devoured it. Blake watched as the reputation of the prosecutor's office crumbled, as long-buried secrets began to surface, each one more damaging than the last. Blake's name was dragged into the mess, not because he was directly involved, but because of the proximity of the scandal. It became clear that the system he had worked so hard to uphold wasn't as infallible as he had always believed. And so, Blake found himself at a crossroads. The career he had built on conviction and reputation was now tainted. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. The guilt from the case of the young woman he had lost began to weigh on him. But it wasn't just that. It was Jamal Thompson. The name kept creeping into his thoughts, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Blake had never thought much about the man he had sent to prison. Jamal was just a casualty, a name in the record books, a number. But now, with everything falling apart, Blake started to wonder, had he made a mistake? It wasn't a question of whether or not Jamal was innocent, he knew that. Deep down, Blake had always known. There had been too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. But in that moment, Blake had ignored them, driven by the need to win. What he didn't expect was the realization that he was complicit in sending an innocent man to rot in prison. The guilt was unbearable, and Blake couldn't escape it. It was late one night when the phone call came. Blake had been sitting alone in his office, staring at a pile of case files that he no longer cared about. He picked up the phone absent-mindedly, his mind preoccupied with the overwhelming mess that was his life. The voice on the other end startled him, though he should have expected it. "Mr. Blake," the voice said, low and cautious, "this is Jamal Thompson." Blake's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard that name in years, but hearing it now felt like a jolt of electricity. Jamal Thompson, the man whose life he had destroyed, the man who had been locked away in a cell while Blake continued to climb higher. For a moment, Blake couldn't speak. But then, with a voice barely above a whisper, Jamal continued, "I don't know what you're going through right now, but I know what you did to me. And I know you know what you did, but I need your help." The words echoed in Blake's mind, each one a hammer striking his conscience. Jamal needed his help. After everything, after all the suffering, after the years of wrongful imprisonment, Jamal wanted to talk. Blake's mind raced, unsure of what to say or do. There was no simple answer, no easy way out. All Blake knew was that this was his chance to make things right, if it wasn't too late. But was Jamal ready to forgive the man who had ruined his life? Was Blake prepared to confront the full weight of his actions? The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence between them hung heavily on the phone line. Blake could hear his own breath, shallow and uneven, but Jamal said nothing. It felt as though the weight of the years that had passed between them was pressing in on both of them. For a long moment, Blake wondered if he should just hang up, pretend this conversation had never happened. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. Jamal broke the silence first, his voice low but steady. "I've had years to think about it, Mr. Blake, and I know you didn't care then, but maybe you care now." There was a bitterness in Jamal's tone, an edge that Blake hadn't expected. He knew he had earned it, but hearing it felt like a slap to the face. "But this isn't about you, is it? It's about what happened to me, to my family. All the years I lost, years I'll never get back." Blake swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt useless. What could he possibly say to someone like Jamal, to someone who had every reason to hate him? All Blake had ever known was the conviction, the chase for justice, his justice. He had never considered the lives that were appended in the process, the families torn apart. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Jamal," Blake finally muttered, though it sounded more like a confession than an apology. "But I need you to understand something. I never wanted to ruin your life." "Then why did you?" Jamal's voice was colder now, sharper. "Why didn't you care? Why didn't you see that I was innocent? You didn't want justice. You wanted a win. You wanted to keep your record spotless, even if it meant breaking me." Blake clenched his jaw, the words cutting deeper than any verdict ever could. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he had done the right thing, that Jamal was just another part of the system, a statistic, a name, a casualty of the game. But now, in the face of Jamal's anger, Blake could feel the truth pressing in from all sides. He had been wrong. He had let his ambition cloud his judgment, and it had destroyed someone's life in the process. "I can't change what happened," Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can try to make it right. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jamal. I'm asking for a chance to help you." The line went dead quiet. Blake could feel his heart pounding, every second dragging on as he waited for Jamal's response. Was this it? Would this be the moment when everything came crashing down? Was there any way back from what had been done? Finally, Jamal spoke again, though his voice had softened. "What do you mean? You want to help me?" There was disbelief in his tone, like he couldn't quite wrap his mind around the idea of the man who had sent him to prison now offering to help him. Blake took a deep breath, his mind spinning as he tried to find the right words. "I've been looking into your case, Jamal. I know I messed up, and I know there's nothing I can do to undo it, but I can help get you out. I can work to expose what really happened, bring the truth to light. If you're willing to trust me, I can make this right." Jamal was quiet again, the tension palpable. Blake could almost hear the wheels turning in Jamal's mind. The doubt, the anger, the confusion. After a long pause, Jamal spoke again, his voice rougher, more resigned. "You think I can just forget everything, don't you? You think I can just forget the years I spent in that hellhole, the friends I lost, the family who gave up on me? You can't fix that, Mr. Blake." Blake didn't know how to respond. He had no answer for Jamal's pain. How could he? What words could ever make up for the years that had been stolen from him, for the trust that had been shattered? "I don't expect you to forget," Blake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his own regret. "But maybe we can start by telling the truth. Maybe that's all I can offer you." Jamal's sigh came through the line, heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know if that's enough," he muttered. "I don't know if anything is enough." Blake could feel the walls between them. Jamal's anger, his hurt, were real and raw, and no matter how hard Blake tried to reach out, they remained a barrier. Blake had destroyed something that could never be rebuilt, and now he was trying to convince a man who had suffered beyond measure that redemption was possible. But Jamal wasn't ready, not yet. As the conversation began to wind down, Blake felt like he was walking on the edge of a cliff, unsure if he would fall or find some way to climb back up. He had made the call, had taken the first step, but he couldn't help but wonder if he had just made a mistake. Maybe he was just digging himself into a deeper hole. Maybe there was no way to fix what had been broken. But as he hung up the phone, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. This was only the beginning. Helping Jamal wouldn't be easy. It would be messy, complicated, and dangerous. There were powerful people who didn't want the truth to come out, people who had their own interests in keeping the case buried. Blake knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, and more importantly, he needed Jamal to believe in him. But was that even possible? Could Jamal ever trust him again after everything he had done? Would the truth be enough to tear down the years of hate, anger, and betrayal that had festered between them? As the days passed, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. His decision to help Jamal wasn't just about redemption. There was something more, something deeper. What if this was all part of a bigger story, a story of corruption, of a system that had failed them both? In the meantime, Jamal wrestled with his own demons. Could he really let go of his rage and distrust? Could he trust the man who had locked him away for so long, the man who had taken so much from him? Or was Blake just another player in the same broken system that had destroyed his life? The tension between them grew, the stakes higher with each passing day. What had started as a single phone call had now become something much more. Each step they took toward the truth only uncovered more questions, more danger. They were both walking a tightrope, unsure of what lay beneath them, uncertain whether they could find the ground again or if they would both fall. The story wasn't over. It had barely begun. The days following the phone call seemed to drag on in a haze, each moment filled with uncertainty. Blake couldn't stop thinking about Jamal, about the anger in his voice, the bitterness that was so thick it was almost palpable. He had tried to convince himself that what he was doing was right, that helping Jamal was the first step toward redemption. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had to lose. If this backfired, if Jamal refused to cooperate or worse, exposed him for what he had done, it could destroy everything Blake had worked for. His career, his reputation, everything. Meanwhile, Jamal's world had become a constant battle between his desire for justice and the weight of his resentment. The idea of working with Blake, of trusting the man who had taken so much from him, felt impossible. Every part of him screamed that it wasn't right, that Blake was only trying to save himself. But there was that part of him, the one that had clung to hope all those years in prison, that wondered if this could be a chance to finally get the truth out. His instincts told him to stay away, to keep his distance, but there was also the voice in the back of his mind that wondered if forgiveness, at least the kind that allowed him to move forward, was possible. As the days wore on, Blake dug deeper into the case. He reached out to contacts, to old colleagues, and even to investigative journalists who might be able to help. What he uncovered was shocking. There were discrepancies in the original trial that no one had bothered to address at the time, hidden evidence that had been deliberately ignored. The corruption ran deeper than he had ever imagined. He had been a part of it all. But now, in his search for redemption, Blake realized that the system he had once trusted was broken beyond repair. And the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became for both him and Jamal. There were whispers in the legal community, rumors that something was about to explode. Blake couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at him. People who had been involved in Jamal's case, people who had knowingly turned a blind eye to the truth, began to grow wary of his investigation. It was clear that someone didn't want the truth to come out, and they would stop at nothing to keep it buried. One evening, Blake received an anonymous message. The screen of his phone lit up with a single line of text. *stop digging. You won't like what you find. It was a warning, but it only pushed him further. The fear was real now. There were people out there who'd go to extreme lengths to protect the lie. And Blake was beginning to realize just how far the web of corruption spread. The tension began to rise between Blake and Jamal. Blake had continued to reach out, pushing for some kind of partnership, but Jamal remained distant, his trust stretched thin. The more Blake tried to explain himself, the more Jamal pulled away. Each phone call, each email, only seemed to deepen the rift between them. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that Blake was only in it for his own redemption, not for justice. He had spent years fighting for his freedom, and now, when it was within reach, the man who had been responsible for his wrongful conviction wanted to be the one to set things right. It didn't feel real. It felt like another trap. Blake knew that if he didn't win Jamal over, he was running out of time. With the legal system fighting back, with the corruption pulling strings behind the scenes, they were running out of options. Blake had no choice but to take risks. He reached out to a few trusted sources, one of whom had been an insider in the prosecutor's office at the time of Jamal's trial. What he learned shook him to his core. The prosecutor, a former ally who had once supported him, had been involved in the suppression of evidence that would have exonerated Jamal. The discovery was explosive, enough to bring the entire case into question, but it also made Blake a target. The people involved in the conspiracy weren't going to let this slip by without a fight. Meanwhile, Jamal felt the pressure mounting. He had never been more aware of the danger he was in, but now it wasn't just his past haunting him, it was his future. He was caught between two worlds, the one where he could keep fighting, where he could take control of his own story, and the one where Blake was offering him a way out, a chance to make things right. The walls were closing in on both of them, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that trusting Blake was a risk he might not be able to afford. The call came one night, as Blake was sitting in his dimly lit office, papers scattered across the desk, his mind whirling with all the things he had uncovered. He had been preparing himself for another round of rejection from Jamal, but this time it was different. The voice on the other end wasn't Jamal's at first, it was a woman's. "Mr. Blake," the woman said, her voice soft yet firm. "Jamal's been watching you. He wants to meet." Blake's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was this the moment everything would change? For years, he had been haunted by the man he wronged. And now, it seemed like that man was finally ready to listen. "Where?" Blake asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The place where it all began," she replied, before the line went dead. Blake's mind raced, the courthouse. It was the only place that made sense, the only place where everything had started to unravel. But he also knew that meeting there, in that place of twisted memories, was risky. Jamal was taking a leap of faith, and Blake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for them to slip up. As Blake arrived at the courthouse the next evening, the air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. He hadn't been there in years, but everything about it felt the same, stale, suffocating. The last time he had walked through those doors, it had been with his head held high, full of confidence. Now he walked with caution, the weight of the years pressing down on him. Jamal was already there when he arrived, sitting on the steps, staring out into the street. There was no warm greeting, no handshake, just a cold silence. Blake took a seat beside him, but he could feel the tension crackling between them, the gulf of mistrust still wide and deep. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Blake didn't know what to say. He had been preparing for this moment for so long, and yet now, faced with the reality of it, the words didn't come. Finally, Jamal spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. "You want to know why I'm here? It's not for you. It's for the truth. The truth that you stole from me. The truth that you buried for years." Blake's throat tightened. "I know." And just like that, the truth seemed to hang between them. There was no way to erase the years of pain, the years of lies. But maybe, just maybe, they could do something now. Maybe they could expose the truth, tear down the walls, and finally get the justice that had been denied for so long. But as they sat there, in the shadow of the courthouse, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was already closing in, that the real battle was just beginning. As the night grew darker, the air between Blake and Jamal seemed to thicken, the tension palpable. Blake was still trying to make sense of Jamal's cold words, struggling to find a way to bridge the gap that years of injustice had created. But then, just as Blake thought he might finally break through, a car screeched to a halt at the end of the block, its headlights blinding them for a moment. Jamal tensed beside him, eyes narrowing as he scanned the street. Blake felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a pulse of danger, as if the world had shifted and now everything was on the line. Something was wrong. Blake instinctively stood up, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew it wasn't good. Jamal remained seated, but his hand hovered near the inside of his jacket, as if he too could sense that something was about to go terribly wrong. A figure stepped out of the car, silhouetted against the bright headlights, and for a moment, Blake thought it was just a passerby. But the figure moved with purpose, their gait determined, as if they were coming straight toward them. Blake's heart began to pound in his chest. This was no coincidence. Whoever this was, they weren't here for a casual conversation. Before Blake could even think of what to say, the stranger was close enough to make out. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the darkness and the brim of a hat pulled low over his brow. He stopped just a few feet from them, exhaling smoke from a cigarette. Blake could feel Jamal's muscles stiffen next to him, his posture turning defensive. "Blake," the man's voice was low, gravelly, with a hint of something threatening beneath the surface. "Didn't expect to find you here." Blake's mind spun as he tried to make sense of the situation. He recognized the man now, an old associate from his past, someone who had always been on the fringes of his life. "What are you doing here, Rick?" Blake asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing sense of danger. Rick smirked, taking another drag from his cigarette before flicking it to the ground. "I think you know why I'm here, and I think you know it's not good for you." Jamal stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "Who the hell is this, Blake?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. Blake didn't answer immediately, his mind racing. Rick had always been a loose cannon, someone involved in less than legal dealings. But Blake hadn't seen him in years. Why was he here now? And why with such an ominous tone? "Listen, Jamal," Blake said, trying to remain calm. "This guy, he's not a part of this. Just stay back, all right?" But Jamal didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes locked on Rick. "What do you want with Blake?" he demanded. Rick chuckled darkly. "You're the one asking the questions now. You really think I'm here for a chat?" He glanced between the two men, his smile widening. "You both have no idea what you stumbled into." Blake's stomach dropped. Something was wrong, very wrong. He had been digging into the case, trying to uncover the truth, but had he unknowingly stirred up something far more dangerous than he'd ever anticipated? "You've been digging around," Rick continued, his voice now colder, his eyes gleaming with a strange mix of amusement and menace. "And you know what happens when people dig too deep? They get buried. The past isn't something you mess with, Blake. Some things are better left alone." Blake's pulse quickened. Was this a warning? Or was Rick about to push things further, trying to intimidate him into backing off? "I don't care about your threats, Rick," Blake said, his voice more forceful than he felt. "This has gone too far. People deserve to know the truth. I'm not stopping until I get it." Rick's expression darkened, and his stance shifted, his hands moving toward his jacket. Blake took a half step back instinctively, his heart pounding, suddenly aware of just how close things were to spiraling completely out of control. "You don't get it," Rick growled. "The truth, that's not what this is about. This is bigger than you, bigger than Jamal. This is about power, Blake. And people like you and me, we don't get to decide when the truth comes out. You're in way over your head." Before Blake could respond, Rick reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, tossing it onto the ground at Blake's feet. The cold weight of it seemed to hang in the air like an omen. "You keep looking into this, and you'll regret it," Rick warned, his voice darkening further. Jamal bent down and picked up the envelope, glancing at Blake. "What's this?" he asked, his tone now edged with suspicion. Blake didn't know what to say. The tension between them had reached a boiling point. Rick's cryptic warning hung in the air like a thick fog, and Blake felt the weight of it settling in his chest. He had no idea what was inside that envelope, but he knew it wasn't good. Jamal ripped the envelope open, pulling out a single piece of paper. As his eyes skimmed the contents, his face shifted, his expression growing darker by the second. Blake leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse, but Jamal quickly folded the paper, his hands trembling slightly. "Is this real?" Jamal asked, his voice quiet but intense, the anger in his tone unmistakable. Blake felt a chill run down his spine. "What does it say?" Jamal turned to face him, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. "You were right to look into this case, Blake, but you've been looking in all the wrong places." His voice trembled as he spoke again, more quietly now. "The real story, it's not just about me, it's about you too." Blake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Jamal didn't answer immediately, his eyes still glued to the paper in his hands. The weight of the words in his hands seemed to carry the gravity of everything that had led them here, the betrayals, the lies, and the horrifying truths they were only now beginning to uncover. Rick's voice cut through the silence. "I think it's time you both realize how deep this goes, and just how many people are involved in making sure it stays buried." Blake stood frozen, his mind racing. What had he just uncovered? What was in that envelope, and who else was in on this conspiracy? As the realization began to settle in, Blake knew that the stakes were higher than ever. The game had changed. The truth they had been chasing wasn't just going to set Jamal free, it was going to bring down everything. And Blake wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. The cold night air seemed to wrap around them like a vice as Blake stared at Jamal, his mind racing. The silence between them was thick with tension. What could possibly be in that envelope that would shake Jamal to his core? Blake's heart pounded in his chest. Everything had been building up to this moment, the lies, the corruption, the years of injustice. But now the truth was within reach, and Blake couldn't tell if it would finally set them free or trap them deeper in a web of deceit. Jamal folded the paper back into the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He was trying to stay composed, but Blake could see the struggle in his eyes. "You need to see this," Jamal finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He handed the envelope to Blake, his eyes never leaving it. Blake hesitated before taking the paper, his fingers brushing against the cold, stiff material. The words on the page were short, but the implications were staggering. It was a letter, one that had been written years ago, long before Blake had ever crossed paths with Jamal. The letter was from none other than Rick, the man who had just left them with such a cryptic warning. But it wasn't just any letter, it was a confession. A confession of not just tampering with evidence in Jamal's case, but of orchestrating the entire wrongful conviction from the very beginning. Blake's stomach turned as he read through the letter. It outlined how the prosecutor, who Blake had once considered a friend, had been blackmailed by powerful individuals, people who had a vested interest in keeping Jamal behind bars. The letter went on to reveal that Rick, as a fixer, had been instrumental in covering up critical evidence that would have proven Jamal's innocence. But it didn't stop there. The final lines of the letter sent a shiver down Blake's spine. It claimed that the prosecutor's involvement went even deeper. He had been bribed to convict an innocent man to protect those with far more dangerous secrets, secrets that could unravel a powerful network of corruption at the highest levels. Blake's mind raced as he tried to process the magnitude of what he was reading. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the truth was more horrifying than he had ever imagined. For years, he had believed he was part of a broken system, one that simply made mistakes. But what he was holding in his hands revealed a deliberate, calculated conspiracy, one that reached far beyond a single trial. "Jamal," Blake said, his voice shaky with disbelief. This is everything. This is the proof you needed. The one thing that could take this whole case down." Jamal didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning Blake's face, reading the weight of his words. He was processing it all too. The long-awaited moment of vindication that had seemed so out of reach for so many years. But there was something else in Jamal's eyes now, something darker. Blake looked at him, confused. "Jamal, what's wrong?" "I know," Jamal said quietly. "I know what it says, but that doesn't change anything. You still took years of my life from me. You still put me behind bars for a crime I didn't commit." His voice hardened with an edge of finality. "And now you're just handing the evidence like it's some kind of gift." Blake's heart sank. He had thought that once the truth came to light, everything would be different, that Jamal would finally see that he had been working for justice. But Jamal wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, and Blake couldn't blame him. Just as Blake opened his mouth to speak, the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the empty streets. Both men turned toward the sound. In the dim glow of the streetlights, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly and deliberately toward them. Rick. He was back. Blake's pulse quickened. "What the hell are you doing here?" Blake demanded, stepping forward, his hand instinctively reaching into his jacket, searching for anything that might protect them from whatever Rick was about to do. Rick stopped a few feet from them, his face cold and unreadable. "You think you can just walk away from this, Blake? You really think exposing the truth will fix everything?" His voice was low, almost mocking, but there was something more behind it, something desperate, dangerous. Blake clenched his fists, ready for a fight. "This ends now, Rick. You can't keep hiding behind the lies. Jamal deserves to be free." Rick gave a low, humorless laugh. "Free? You think this is just about Jamal?" He took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Blake. "This goes much deeper. And now you've opened a door that you can't close. I told you not to dig, but you didn't listen." The weight of his words sank in as Blake realized a final, terrible twist of the story. Rick wasn't just a bystander in all of this. He was part of something much bigger, something Blake couldn't fully comprehend. The corruption wasn't isolated. It wasn't just about Jamal's case. It was a network of power, extending far beyond anything Blake had imagined. Rick had made it clear. Once the truth came out, it wouldn't just bring down the prosecutor or the people who had conspired against Jamal. It would bring down everything. And there were people out there who would do anything to protect that power. Blake's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying? What happens now?" Rick's smile faltered. "What happens now is that you have a choice. You can walk away and let this go, forget what you know. Or you can keep digging and risk losing everything. You'll never be safe, not with this kind of information. People like me, we have connections. We can make sure this all stays buried. Forever." Blake's mind raced, the weight of Rick's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. For the first time, Blake felt the full force of the consequences. There was no going back from this. The truth was out, but the cost of exposing it was more than he was willing to pay. And the power behind the lie wasn't going to let it be revealed without a fight. Jamal looked at Blake, his eyes hard, resigned. "You know what you have to do, don't you?" Blake turned toward Jamal, confusion and fear swirling in his chest. Jamal's gaze was steady, but there was a finality to his words that Blake couldn't ignore. "This isn't just your fight anymore," Jamal said. "This is ours, and we need to make sure that no one else suffers because of it." Blake swallowed hard. The path ahead was unclear, the stakes higher than ever. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just about righting the wrong of the past, it was about survival. And as they both stood there, staring into the uncertainty of the future, they realized they weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for their lives. And just as they prepared to make their move, a loud crash echoed through the night. The unmistakable sound of tires screeching. Blake turned in horror, realizing that the game had just shifted again, far more dangerous, more deadly than they had ever imagined. The truth had been uncovered, but the cost was only just beginning. The screeching tires grew louder, growing nearer with each passing second. Blake's heart raced, his mind scrambled for a plan, but all he could hear now was the thunderous sound of the car as it slammed into the curb. He spun around to see headlights barreling toward them, blinding him momentarily. Then, in the next instant, the vehicle came to a screeching halt just a few feet away, throwing up dust and debris as it stopped. The door flung open and a figure emerged. It was another man, but this one wasn't someone Blake recognized. The new arrival wore a sharp suit and an expression as cold as steel. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "You two need to get in," the man ordered, his voice hard and no nonsense. "Now." Blake exchanged a quick glance with Jamal. The tension in the air felt like a ticking time bomb. For a brief moment, both men considered their options. The truth was out, but there were still far too many dangerous people who would stop at nothing to ensure it stayed buried. They had to make a decision. They had to move. Jamal nodded to Blake. "We don't have much time," he said quietly, his voice filled with urgency. There was a shared understanding between them now. They were in too deep to turn back. Whatever the man's intentions were, there was no other option but to trust him, at least for the moment. They both moved quickly, sliding into the back of the car, and the man slammed the door shut behind them. The car rolled to life and sped off into the night, the city lights blurring as they raced through the streets. The silence inside the vehicle was thick with tension as the man at the wheel drove with precision, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. Blake was the first to speak. "Who the hell are you?" The man's eyes flickered briefly to the rearview mirror, his face unreadable. "Does it matter?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "What matters now is making sure the truth doesn't come back to bite you." Jamal's hands were clenched at his sides, his mind still processing the sudden shift in events. "We're not backing down," he said, his voice low, determined. "The truth comes out. It's over." The man glanced at him briefly, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You think it's that simple?" he asked. "There are too many people involved in this, too much at stake." Blake felt a chill settle in his chest. He knew the man was right. This wasn't just about Jamal's case anymore. This was about a network of corruption, power, and influence that stretched far beyond what they could comprehend. He looked at Jamal, who was staring out the window, his face set in stone. "What happens now?" Blake asked, the weight of their situation sinking in. "How do we stop it?" The man didn't answer right away, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as he navigated the city streets with ease. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower now, tinged with something like regret. The man paused for a moment, his jaw tightening. "A price you'll be willing to pay. If you want the truth to come out, if you want to take down those responsible for everything, you're going to have to sacrifice everything." Blake swallowed hard. He had already lost so much, his career, his reputation, and now his peace of mind. He had been willing to go to great lengths for justice, but now it seemed as though the cost was more than he could bear. Jamal turned slowly, meeting his gaze. There was a fire in his eyes, a determination that had never wavered. "We're already too far in," Jamal replied. "There's no going back now. The truth needs to come out, not just for me, for everyone else who's been silenced." Blake nodded. He understood. He had thought for a moment that they might have another choice, that there might be a way out of all this. But there wasn't. Not anymore. The truth was bigger than both of them, and now it was up to them to make sure it didn't get buried again. The car pulled up to a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. The man in the front seat looked at them for the first time since they'd gotten in. "This is it," he said. "Once you walk through those doors, there's no turning back. You're in this fight now, and you better be prepared for the fallout." Blake didn't need to hear more. He knew what was at stake. They both did. As the car came to a stop, they both stepped out, their feet hitting the ground with a sense of finality. Inside the building, they were led down a long hallway, the lights flickering overhead, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Blake's nerves were on edge, his every step feeling heavier than the last. They entered a small, dimly lit room where a group of people was already gathered, their faces stern and unreadable. It was clear that these were the ones who held the power, the ones who could make or break their fight for justice. The man who had driven them here stood at the door, his arms folded across his chest. "This is where you make your move," he said. "But remember, there's no turning back. Once you expose what you know, everything changes." Blake and Jamal exchanged one last glance before stepping into the room. The air was thick with anticipation, as though everyone in the room knew what was coming and was ready for it. Blake's hands shook as he held up the envelope, the confession that had been the key to everything. "This is it," he said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This is the truth, and we're not going to stop until it's out in the open." The room fell silent, every eye locked on him. Jamal stood beside him, his expression resolute. "What are you prepared to lose?" one of the figures in the room asked, his voice low, cutting through the silence. Blake didn't hesitate. Everything. The door behind them slammed shut, and they realized at that moment that there was no going back. They had made their choice. The truth would come to light, and the world would have to reckon with the consequences. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Blake felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It was done. The battle had been fought, and now all they could do was watch as the truth set them both free. But as the story of Jamal's wrongful conviction spread, reaching the hearts of those who had never known the truth, it became clear that the ripples of their actions would touch far more lives than they had ever imagined. The fight for justice had begun, and though the cost had been great, it had been worth every sacrifice. But as Blake and Jamal walked out of that room, they both knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning.